So, John, let's try this. I mean, we talked about maybe having yourself, understanding you're 51 years old, but try to introduce yourself as a 21-year-old man to give our listeners a little idea of, what it was like at younger periods of your life, John.
Oh, boy. Interestingly enough, as far as the project is concerned, days of yesteryear, the project started, the seeds for this project started, 30 years ago almost, when I was a young guy. I had grown up in Chicago, Guillermo, and although I'd grown up in a city that certainly, is a big metropolitan area, I was kind of shielded or protected or just didn't see much urban blight. We lived out in the suburbs. I got out of college and went to work for Ralph Lauren in New York, and that was the first time that I'd ever really seen the folks that were living on the street. And the human misery that I saw, affected me as a young man, and it stayed with me for, almost 30 years now. I can remember in the mid to late 80s working for Ralph Lauren, and some of the New Yorkers, they'd say, "Hey, kid, you got to stop giving these, bums money. You're going to be broke." And I can still remember my response, and I remember being taken aback by the notion that, these are people, aren't they? Bums? That seems a little crass and cold. And I remember the man that had made that remark to me and said, I just got out of college. I know what it's like to be broke. I think I'll be all right. So I'd wanted to do something around the cause of homelessness for years. And, fast forward a couple decades, I think a friend of mine in the art business, I'm in the art business. That's my day job. I published and created a magazine in the desert here for a bunch of years around the arts, and we transitioned into creating coffee table books to become objects of art for individual artists. But a friend of mine that's an artist in Santa Fe, I remember talking to him about, well, maybe I'll take some pictures around, leverage some relationships I have in the art business. I bet I could possibly get a show, perhaps start a conversation. I know the bookmaking end of things, maybe I'll do a book. And there were just a lot of maybes, and there was a lot of talk, Guillermo, for years. And finally, while visiting Santa Fe, perhaps 10 years ago, a friend of mine had said, you've talked about this for a bunch of years. Why don't you do something? And so he kind of lit a fire under my rear end, and I said, I just need a plan, man. And he said, no, you just need a camera. So that's where the I Have a Name project started. I put a camera in the car and thought if I happened across somebody that looked like they were in need, I might get out and have a conversation and see how those things might unfold. I didn't have any construct necessarily. I didn't know what I might call this project, or even if it was a project. But in that first conversation, I remember being very concerned about how I was going to approach somebody. It
Right.
felt very foreign to me. I wanted to handle, that conversation or that approach in a very dignified way. I certainly didn't want to mention that I was working on, I didn't want to identify or create a conversation around identifying a person as homeless. I thought that was, it's so dehumanizing to be on the street to begin with. And, the mind, oftentimes, we're all human beings that are fallible and make mistakes. And, I for one, I have, kind of negative imprinting or recording that is, mind chatter. And I just thought, somebody doesn't necessarily need to be reminded that they're homeless. It's obvious. So in that first approach, I said, I'm working on a project for people in need, and I'm not sure if you're in need or not, but if you are, could we have a conversation? And that man, I can remember this was, in 2007. I can remember this as though it were just yesterday. That man's face is forever etched in my mind, and that moment. And he said, I'm homeless. Yeah, I'm in need. I'll talk to you. And we began to talk, and then I realized, Guillermo, that I hadn't introduced myself. And I said, forgive me, my name is John. What is your name? And he started to weep, and he said, you have no idea how long it's been since somebody's cared to ask me who I am. We're like the walking invisible, America's forgotten. And we were both, it was a poignant, very heavy moment. We were both in tears, and in that moment, the project became I Have a Name. And that man's name is Chuck Ridgway.
That's a beautiful story, and that's a beautiful way that you do your work, John. So hearing your backstory, it seems being in the book business would have certainly given you some practice on your written word, because I really appreciate how you blend the written word and the photojournalism together to create a package that really connects you with people.
Well, and that's really what this is about. I've really become, in some ways, I think to characterize it as an unwitting participant doesn't necessarily define, the role that I've played around advocating for the homeless. I took photographs for a bunch of years. We had a bank in town that was going to finance the project, pay for the prints, pay for a book. The financing was pulled after a year of hard work on the project. When we went into this, this now what we know is, a great recession. And so the economic collapse pulled the financing on the project. I shelved the project. We lost half of our business. And in 2012, Phoenix, where I live, we seemed to be really bursting at the seams in homelessness. And in spite of a lot of the, media reports around, particularly veteran homelessness coming to an end, programs around housing that have helped create an opportunity for folks to find homes again. I can tell you that the problems here on our streets and in the cities that I've traveled to, it's just as dire as it was a few years back. I think that there's a lot of political talking points that people will use to create kind of a feel-good notion, especially around elections or voting time. I see it every day, and it's just as dire. And I'm not a cynic by any measure. I'm the eternal optimist, and I can tell you that this problem is real. We just did an outreach this weekend, and I've never seen so many folks on the streets of Phoenix in need. I expected really in 2012, then when I picked the project back up and I thought I'll figure out how to finance this on my own, we did an art show. I created a social media page for the project at that time just to create awareness for an art event. And I was really just using social media to promote the fact that we were having an exhibition that I hoped might open up a conversation here, at least in our little neighborhood, about the need of folks that are on the street, and that the folks that are out there are actually they're human beings. They're not roadside obstructions or windows to look through or beyond. And I thought after that initial exhibition that I'd most likely done my little part and helping again create a conversation. And I know when I created that Facebook page, Guillermo, I had 55 Facebook friends, and out of those 55 Facebook friends, I'm certain that I didn't know 25 of those folks. Yeah. I felt I had no real interest in social media. I didn't think it was necessarily useful. I saw a lot of photographs of food or selfies, and I just thought, why do I want to do this? And what I can tell you is that I have a great respect for social media as a result some years later. I mean, we have between a few platforms now, be it a website, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, we have almost 45,000 people that follow the I Have a Name project, and the analytics support that there is. We have a reach of mostly in obviously English-speaking countries, but there are reports that show that we have a reach in 44 countries across the globe, and I get messages, touching messages, moving messages from as far away as Melbourne, Australia. We have a lot of folks that follow the project in the United Kingdom. We have somebody that reached out from South Africa and asked if they could use the I Have a Name brand, if you will, to create a similar type of message in South Africa. I've had folks reach out from Juneau, Alaska, a small little, by most standards in the United States, a reasonably small city by city standards, a Canadian city, Thunder Bay, Ontario. There's, I think, probably a dozen people that follow us there, 24 people that are advocates for the homeless, and they've asked if I bring the exhibition component to their city. It's amazing what social media can do in terms of spreading content and message and creating awareness. And then we've been able to do some really, really neat things with the project, subject, again, to that reach, if you will. There was a young girl that was murdered on the streets of Seattle, up in the Northwest. She was 18 years old. She had the mental faculties of a 13-year-old. Her parents, because she was 18 and of age, could not keep her home. She followed a boy to the Northwest, and they lived on the streets. She lost her life on the streets, and her folks didn't have the financial wherewithal to bring the little girl's body home. They couldn't get her out of the morgue. So we actually used the Facebook page and the Instagram page at that point to broadcast a message to try to give this little girl a dignified goodbye. And we raised $3,400, I believe, in 14 days. That was certainly enough to get her out of the morgue and say a proper goodbye. So we've had, some very, very touching moments on the page that, really keep me going, because I didn't expect necessarily to be doing, this type of work with, a full-time job as well. And I think most people would think, I've had people make comments that, how many hours do you think you spent last year on the project? And I said, I calculated that it was about 1,800 hours, so 1,800 hours of unpaid work. Most people would think that, why would someone do that? And my response has always been that I have a job that essentially pays my bills, and I have another job that, pays heavy dividends to my soul. And that job is I have a name.
So I see, I'm actually on your site, and I see you're almost up to 27,000 followers, and I think that has a lot to say for your technique. I mean, you have a way to artfully and respectfully connect people to other fellow human beings. And one thing I'd throw out there for a question is, all the work that I do, and I do visual journalism, which is photography, audio, moving images, sound, I always make sure that the primary audience is the person I'm physically interviewing. I make a real determination to do that, and I don't interview every single person, nowhere near every single person that I talk to.
We absolutely do a very similar body of work in that context. And what was your question, Guillermo? I'm sorry, I was interrupted. Forgive me.
No worries. But what I wanted to kind of pull a couple more stories from you is, some of the most amazing backstories I have is coming back with that piece of art, be it the photography or the written word or the video, and showing it to people. I mean, I've had some unbelievable responses.
It creates connectivity. Mm-hmm. And not only, interestingly enough, connectivity, I've mentioned this several times, whether it be in newspaper interviews or television interviews or just conversations with folks that are curious about the project and what we do, and it has many moving parts. It's certainly an art and advocacy project with an exhibition component, but we do a heavy amount of outreach here in Phoenix, and I continue to take photographs every week. I don't have to necessarily anymore. I'm telling myself that perhaps I'll do another book at some point, and maybe title the book Street Diaries or Broken Lives. And whether or not I end up doing another book or not is really, it's of no consequence to the real motivation in terms of being out there. And it's an opportunity for me now at this point to really have, and I'm certain that you understand this, and it is probably very similar for you. It's an opportunity to have a moment of, 30 minutes, sometimes an hour, a conversation with someone that allows me to do one-on-one outreach. And there are many times where those stories, I don't take a photograph. And I'm kind of old school in the respect that, my daughter teases me and she's like, Dad, on your iPad, you can make notes there. And I try to commit things to memory. And then when I go home later, whether it be in the evening or whenever that might be, I go back and put essentially a pen to paper and write the stories out. But many times, those stories never get that far, for respect to that person in terms of, they don't want their story told.
Yeah,
so for me, really, that motivation is every time that I go out, I'll have socks, or I bring water, and I'll ask the person if they need a meal. In spite of what some people think, I will always give somebody a little bit of money. And with all that said, those things are wonderful to provide. What I've noticed in all candor is that the thing that I can provide that is the most valuable is just what we're doing right now. It's a conversation, because it's so, as I'd mentioned, folks that are on the street become so disconnected to daily life that, they may go days without speaking to someone, weeks perhaps, and they forget what it's like to be a human being. Even today, for instance, we're helping a man right now get off the street, and I took him this morning to an eye doctor, and I've been putting him up at a hotel until we can get permanent housing, or at least a solution that isn't as temporary as providing motel stay for him. And we've been through the page. We've raised some money to keep him in a motel now for about 8 weeks. There was a park that he used to stay at, and that park was between the eye doctor and where I was dropping him back off at his motel. And as we passed the park, he said, "John, you went too far." I said, "Well, what do you mean I went too far?" And he said, "Oh my God, we just passed the park that I have lived in for 10 years, and I keep forgetting that's no longer home." And, and that was a heavy moment, man. Yeah. I mean, a very, very, very heavy moment. This man, and then the rest of the trip, he was telling me how difficult it is to relearn how to live inside, because he'd forgotten.
10 years.
He'd forgotten what it was like to clean up after himself. Even where to put things in a drawer, how to use a microwave, these kind of things. So it's interesting.
Yeah, it's like Crocodile Dundee without the humor. It really is. I've had similar experiences. I mean, the word that comes to my mind, and actually fits right to your I have a name for is validating. It is so validating for people to know that someone's sitting there genuinely talking to them and
Yes.
caring about what they have to say. And I think that is a blessing that gives both ways, and it's just wonderful. I'm actually on one of your pages. You got this wonderful. I really appreciated this. Someone much wiser than I suggested that there are 3 things we should do every day. Laugh. You should laugh every day. Think. You should spend more time in thought. Cry. You should have your emotions move to tears. If in the next few minutes, we'll provide 2 of these daily requirements. What would you say to add on to that, John, or make us understand what you wanted us to think and when we saw that?
Well, that was a quote by Jim Valvano, and he gave that speech to an audience of folks when he was battling cancer that ultimately took his life. And I remember that speech very poignantly, and what he had meant was that for the human condition to feel rich and for us to feel alive and for us to feel connected, that those were, in his words, 3 things that were critical to his daily routine, that we should be moved to tears, and that we should always remember to laugh. What brought that to the page, that's on our website, and I can tell you that and we should always have moments of really kind of heartful thinking, and when I was producing a video that was just a compilation of photography, I think in fact Bob Hope had mentioned this, that if somebody were to watch or to view some of these photographs that I've taken and some of these narratives that accompany them, that if we aren't, if our hearts aren't moved, we have the worst kind of heart problem. We don't have one. And all too often, that is the case with homelessness. But I think it goes much deeper than that. I don't know that answered your question, but just to expound on where I'm going with this is that, I really believe that, in hearing on the street, and I know that you've heard this, that folks feel as though, they're invisible. That's just, it's kind of a common thematic that you hear from folks. I've heard individuals describe themselves as, windows that people just simply look through and past. And I think that, it's kind of an indictment in many ways about the society that we live in. And really, further than that, the expansive, dire condition that is homelessness. And for us sometimes to recognize that folks are out there and in need, if you look, then you have to acknowledge that there's a problem. And this problem is complex. The answers are many in terms of their solutions, or at least that's oftentimes what you hear. And really, I think the solution is simple. In my experience now of working around this cause, it's just, and I think that you would agree, it's housing first. And that's what needs to happen. Yeah. I believe that as far as the shelter system is concerned, that's a broken model that's proved not to work. I think it's, in many ways, a money-making opportunity for a lot of the institutions that are providing those services. And toured many shelters. I've volunteered at shelters. And conversely, I've seen, this kind of new look or paradigm in providing housing first, permanent supportive housing, and I've seen that firsthand, and that is a working model that I believe does satisfy answers to what needs to be done to curb what's happening on the streets. We'll never end homelessness. That's not going to happen. I don't think any of us are that naive. But we can help people. Recently, I've considered, especially in, like this work that I did with this man today, I think the I Have a Name project going forward, and we will be working, I have a meeting tomorrow with an agency here in town, and we're going to try to bring healthcare to the streets now through a mobile service here in Phoenix. I think we'll partner with this organization. And the notion that we were talking about last week in our initial meeting was, just this idea of helping one person at a time. And through that, perhaps change can be affected, I hope.
Yeah, Bob Woden would say nothing ends homelessness like a home. Maybe, boy,
yeah,
and they can't get any more simple and salient than that. The other thing I would come back towards is it really was touching to me. Actually, did get a little teary-eyed about the whole invisible people kind of concept. Some of the more challenging situations I've seen are when the people want to be invisible. They're hiding so that they can't be seen, or they won't be harassed. And those are some of the toughest ones for me, John. Just to see that people just feel a need to hide and from their community because they've been pushed out like a modern day leper, and it's just wonderful that you've got this 8-year mission that you've been so passionate about, which leads me to this.
Yeah.
I'm going to read your mission.
Sure.
The I Have a Name project firmly resolves to restore dignity, compassion, and understanding for those less fortunate. The project's enduring mission aspires to create greater awareness in the effort to inspire change. Join with us hand in hand as we move forward, delivering hope where hope has run thin. We are giving a voice to the silenced. Has your mission changed much? Has your verbiage changed much these past 8 years?
No, and it hasn't. I think, as I've mentioned, I see more moving parts around the project, but the underlying mission, that remains the same. I mean, and that's really what it is. Whether it's providing dignity to a little girl who lost her life on the street, or I'll tell you, I had coffee last week with a young man, and I'd met this boy on the street, and he is a boy. I mean, he was 19 years old when I met him. I was actually installing the exhibition into a gallery space, and I was moving the work into the gallery, and a boy walked by, and he looked like, just any other kid on the street. He didn't look homeless, is my right. suggestion. Mm-hmm. And he walked by and, kind of looked in the gallery, and a couple hours later I was walking out and he was walking back by, and he had a guitar on his back, and I said, "Hey, how was your jam session, man? You look like a musician." And he said, "Oh, no, man, I wasn't playing any music anywhere. I'm homeless." And the irony of that is I'm walking in with this body of work around homelessness to show this, to install this exhibition, and I have a conversation with a young man that's homeless. Short story long on this is that this boy was a heroin addict, and I sat down with him and spoke to him, and it was around, I remember, it was before Thanksgiving, and I shared, some open, real heavy, kind of heartfelt moments with the young man and said, I can't help but to think what your mother's wondering right now. And I said, but I can tell you because I'm a father. And I know that your mother, she thinks about where you're at and what you're doing every moment. She wonders if you're safe. She wonders if she's going to get a call, whether you're alive or dead or okay. And she doesn't get respite from this word even when she's sleeping, Matt. And I said, there isn't a happy an ending out here for you, and you're a young man with a whole life ahead of you. Try to get yourself clean and get home before Thanksgiving and give your mom really something to be grateful for and thankful for. He did that. Wow. It's interesting because that still touches me some years removed. His mom called me and said, "I don't know what you did to save my boy, but you saved his life." And I said, "I just had a conversation with your son. He saved himself." And she said, "John, but he's full of tattoos, and he looks, most people would have looked past him because he looks like he could be menacing and trouble." And I said, "I didn't even see any of his tattoos. I saw a beautiful kid that just needed somebody to talk to him." And he's been clean for 3 years now. Last summer, he worked on a fishing boat in Alaska. He's back in Phoenix now, and I hadn't seen him for a long time. And we had coffee last week. The kid's an amazing artist. He's a heck of a musician. He's a great painter. And these are the things that can happen I'm no different than anyone else, Guillermo. I'm no different than you. No different than anyone. I think all I've done is just kind of stopped and paused and turned the noise down a little and looked around to see what was going on. And we can all do this. I tell people from the page every day, they'll say, what can you do to help me? And you can't do anything to help me, not necessarily. But we can all be our own superheroes, man. Go volunteer. Get out and talk to somebody. Do a shoe drive. Do a sock drive. Collect some backpacks at school. Volunteer in a soup kitchen. These are things that each and every one of us can do if we're encouraged.
Shout out on the air for Matt, dude, because people don't, like you would just describe, people look past these people. It looks like he's a drug addict. They'd never talk to them. But I have talked to precious few heroin addicts that don't, either right below the surface or deep in their heart, they're living and they know they're in hell. It is, they're in hell. I mean, they don't want to be in this situation. They're just beholden to this.
Because I hear people on this, people will make suggestions to me all the time. Well, what about those drunks that are out there? What about, the drug addicts? What about, those lazy bastards that just don't want to work? These are people. And I've never met an addict on the street that wasn't in pain, that didn't want to be clean. No one wants to live on the street, Guillermo. You know that. No one wants to live there. No one wants that for a life. That is no life. And addiction isn't something that people ask for. The medical community would tell you that it's a disease. Some people will argue against that. And if it's not a proper disease, I can tell you that it's people that are at dis-ease.
Yep.
And
dis-ease.
And I have a real, soft place in my heart for that. I have a friend, and part of the reason that I do this project, I had a dear, dear friend that was a heroin addict in the late 70s. He'd been clean and sober for a bunch of years, Guillermo, and, drove a Lexus, had his own business, wore very nice clothes, had money in the bank, a family. He got in a car accident. They prescribed an opiate for pain relief. It led him straight back to heroin, and it wasn't a slow ride to hell. It was an elevator ride to the bottom. And inside of 18 months, he'd lost everything, and he lived on the street, and he died there. So this can happen to anyone. These things can happen to any of us. And I think that's part of the reason that in some ways, why so many folks will look right through someone, because, I think in many ways we have to realize that, that this can happen.
So my thought is, when we get up to the company and those, actually I think it was a couple that created this new form of opiate, Oxycontin. I think when they get to the gates of heaven, they're going to have a very distressing conversation, because, maybe for the listeners, but there was a drug that was put on the market maybe 10 years ago that literally they've been sued successfully. They have to pay the government, I don't know, hundreds of millions of dollars because they lied, saying, oh, this isn't addictive at all. And so many people that thought the heroin addiction is gone, the heroin epidemic's gone, the Oxycontin people were just mashing this stuff down, snorting it, injecting it. I mean, it was basically free and cheap and accessible heroin. And that company made billions and billions and billions of dollars. So anyway, I could do a whole show on heroin.
That's definitely put a lot of folks on the street. Absolutely, that's put a lot of folks on the street. I'm, again, forever the optimist, and I really do believe that, firmly committed to the belief that humanity is alive and well. I think that as human beings, we are hardwired to help one another. There's evidence of that when there is a natural disaster. That's when we really see these things, whether it's an earthquake in Haiti or a tsunami that affects Japan, tornadoes that ravage this part of the world. And when these things happen, I mean, the human condition is fast to react. And that said, I do believe that ultimately people are good. I just think sometimes we have to be reminded that there are folks that are out there in need. I'm just doing my small little part.
It's been wonderful talking with you, Jon Linton. Maybe we should make this a date. We talk once a year. At least once a year, Jon Linton and I speak.
I think we should do it more often than that. In fact, what I was considering is that we were out in Los Angeles in late June, rather. January starts with a J too. But we were there in late June, and we had a great exhibition, and we were able to go out. We have a sock partner. I would like to give maybe a shout out to Bombas, a great organization that has helped us provide socks to people that are in need. And this organization, for every sock that they sell, they give one away. And they have given us, over this last 12 months, they've given us in excess of 1,000 pairs of socks to hand out. And we handed out on Skid Row, there in the Los Angeles area in June, 500 pair of socks. And they were, the sad part, they were gone in 8 minutes, Guillermo. 8 minutes. So that gives folks some kind of an understanding about how serious this problem is in terms of folks that are living on the street. But I'd love to come back out, and we should put something on the calendar or work to get back there with the project and do something jointly. I'd love it.
It really is. If you think about the fact, people that are involved in this work and people that aren't, that might be listening, you would not believe how important having physical socks are to human beings that are houseless. And I had this hiking group I had started. I came up with this little quote. I said, "If your feet are happy, you're likely not miserable." And that's exactly what I see on the streets. It's just that misery, and it's just wonderful to know that there's folks like Jon Linton and others that are out there handing out socks, handing out love, and giving kindness and care. So
that's just about that's it. It's about handing out love, man. I like that. I may borrow that from you. That's brilliant, because that's exactly what it is.
Yeah. All right, Jon Linton. Bless you, man.
I appreciate all you do, and thanks for the interview, and thanks for your work, Guillermo. You're a good man.
You too, Jon Linton. Take care, man.